So look, I'm going to talk to you again. It's great to be back here, I have to say. I've missed this meeting enormously over the last 5 years, so it's wonderful to be back. I'm going to talk to you again about VQ mismatch, one of my favourite topics. And the reason for this is because, in particular, more specifically, we're talking about VQ scatter in the lungs rather than mismatch per se. So the reason is because this is universal in all our anaesthetised patients. Importantly, we've shown in at least a small study that it's no better with TIVA than it is with inhalation anaesthesia, this problem. And the manifestation of this that's measurable for you is the generation of arterial to alveolar partial pressure differences, or AA differences, for all the gases that you can measure under anaesthesia, particularly for oxygen and CO2. So here's some typical numbers you'll see in an anaesthetised patient, with an end-tidal CO2 in the low 30s and an arterial CO2 in the mid-40s. Very common numbers, I think you'll agree. The same thing applies to your inhalational agent, and here's some data on sevoflurane that we measured in a study some years ago, with substantial AA gradients for your agents, which persist throughout the entire procedure. So what this does is it generates measurable changes in dead space, alveolar dead space and shunt fraction. Now, a little bit of background. All the physiology that you still are taught in the textbooks in the 21st century was generated largely by a very active group of American respiratory physiologists during the Second World War, who were trying to save the lives of American pilots by understanding gas exchange in the setting of altitude physiology. And most of the concepts that we have come from them, including the three-compartment or Riley model of VQ mismatch in the lungs. And in most of the textbooks, it's different diagrams. This is the one that you get out of West's textbook, and it looks like this. You've got an unperfused compartment, which is dead space. You've got an unventilated compartment, which is shunt, and an ideal compartment in the middle where all the gas exchange occurs for all the gases at the same time. This is the simple model that generates the equations that we're familiar with for measuring shunted dead space. So the Bohr equation for measuring dead space and the Bergman shunt equation. The Bohr equation looks like this. The more familiar version of it, because the inspired CO2 is assumed to be zero, the equation simplifies to this formula, which you're all very familiar with. I don't need to dwell on this because this is stuff you guys already know. Essentially, the numerator, which is the expired CO2, is a mixture of what comes out of the ideal compartment and the dead space compartment. If in particular we're measuring end-tidal CO2 in the numerator of the equation, it's alveolar dead space that we're measuring. And that's what's important to us when we're thinking about VQ mismatch in the lungs. It's alveolar dead space you want to concentrate on. So the end-tidal CO2 is the magic number. Importantly, the denominator requires us to know or offer a value for the ideal alveolar CO2 partial pressure coming from that ideal compartment in the middle. Trouble is, there's no way of knowing what's in that compartment. It's a theory of compartment. It's an invention, and we don't know what's in there. Remember, all the gas exchanges happen in this compartment, so it's a very important compartment we've invented, but we don't know what's in there. Anyway, the Enghoff modification said just use the arterial CO2 and everything will be fine. And Riley, in fact, went to some lengths to justify that approximation. In fact, took some ownership of the Enghoff modification, so that the equation that we're familiar with now has arterial CO2 in the denominator of the equation. The problem, of course, is the arterial CO2 is in fact not just the ideal compartment, it's the ideal and the shunt compartment. So that's a problem, isn't it? And everyone knows about this problem, but we just ignore it and get on with things. And this is the equation we're all familiar with if we're wanting to measure alveolar dead space. It's what's taught in the textbooks. But there are lots of reasons to challenge these assumptions and rethink of this very simple physiology that we've been taught, and we continue to be taught. And we sort of treat this stuff as if it's being handed down from on high on a stone tablet, really, when we teach this to our trainees. So here's some data to challenge your assumptions here. This is data that comes from two studies that were conducted, one by Jan and one by me, 20 years apart. Jan is part of his PhD. You were in the States, Jan, weren't you, when this data was being collected, weren't you? Yeah. And I had similar interest, and I did this some years ago. So we measured the alveolar dead space for CO2 and for all the anaesthetic gases that we were using in our anaesthetised patients. There were 4 groups in the study, but this is the summary data from all 4 groups for the Bohr equation, for the alveolar dead space for carbon dioxide. And the mean value is 23%. And that's a very typical number that you'll see in any of your anaesthetised patients having major surgery. Alveolar dead space from the Bohr equation in the mid-20s. There were 4 different groups. They either got DES, SIVO, isoflurane, and Jan wonderfully collected some data on halothane as well. This is the 1990s we're talking about, and thank God he did. Anyway, because the data was very useful. So I'm going to put to you a proposition. If we took the same sample of blood and the same expired breath, and instead of measuring the CO2 in that for that calculation, we measured the sevoflurane partial pressures. Same mixing equation, same principle, same patient, at the same time. What sort of value for alveolar dead space would the sevoflurane give us? 23%? Same as Riley would say so. I don't know, 25, 30%, make up a number. So the dead space for sevoflurane in these patients was 60%. And the same story for the other gases. Slightly lower number for the more soluble gases, a bit lower for isoflurane, a bit lower again for halothane. And you might sort of look at that and think, that's interesting. I wonder if he made a mistake with his measurement, because my technique was a bit homemade, but Jan's data all came from the state-of-the-art gas chromatograph for measuring the partial pressures in the blood, and we got the same results from both subgroups in this study. So it's nothing to do with the assay. This is about the physiology. You might also note that there's a relationship to the solubility of the agent here, which is highly significant, and the halothane data, in fact, nailed this. There's something about the solubility of the gas that dictates the alveolar dead space that the Riley model simply can't conceive of. So I want you to think about this, just how crazy this is. So the Riley model says that if we measure in our patients, this is the mean data, using CO2, that the distribution of ventilation in the lung between the ideal compartment and the dead space compartment looks like this, the green bars. However, if we take the same sample of blood and the same breath and use the sevoflurane partial pressure, it says, oh no, the distribution of ventilation looks like this, with most of it going to the dead space compartment at the same time. I mean, this is crazy. This is like Schrodinger's cat. It can't be possible. But it gets worse, because you have the same problem with shunt calculation. So the shunt equation tells us that, and look, you'll be familiar with you, we need to know ideal alveolar oxygen content and partial pressure to calculate shunt fraction using the Berggren shunt equation. Trouble is, we don't know what's in that ideal compartment. There's an equation which we get taught, which is the ideal alveolar gas equation, which we're told allows us to estimate ideal alveolar oxygen in that compartment. But that's not true. It's never been true. The textbooks teach it, but it's not true. The alveolar gas equation gives you the combined output of the ideal compartment and the dead space compartment. And I can prove that to you if you're interested later on. There isn't time to go into it at the moment, but I published this last year in physiology reports, making these points, which the respiratory physiologists don't like to hear, I have to say. But anyway, so here we have this funny model, the centrepiece of which is this theoretical, mythical ideal compartment, and we have no way of knowing what's in it. Famous quote from the statistician George Box: all models are wrong, but some models are useful. I put to you that this is just a really bad model. The problem is, of course, the lung doesn't look like this. It's never looked like this. The ventilation doesn't look like this. A real lung looks like this. And I've spoken about this before at this meeting, and I'm going to go on about this because we've made some progress in this field, I think, with some new data and some new suggestions. So the x-axis here hasn't changed really, but it's moved from 3 boxes to a continuum. And it's distributions of ventilation and blood flow that really are instructive and allow us to explain all these things and answer all these questions properly. So because a VQ ratio is a fraction, the most useful scale to use to think about the data is always the logarithmic scale. So the x-axis is log scale here, and so these are what we call log normal distributions. And as VQ scatter worsens, those two curves, the ventilation and the blood flow curves, diverge and widen. And the log standard deviation is the width of those curves, and that's how we measure the degree of VQ mismatch. So your VQ distributions will look like the one on the left at the moment. They're narrow and tight and well matched. But our anaesthetised patients look pretty much like the one on the right most of the time, wide and divergent. And you can see now how the concept of dead space is explained by these distributions in a really nice and simple way. You know, the old term of wasted ventilation as the description, a lay description of the concept of dead space. You can see how all that alveolar ventilation on the right-hand side there is actually wasted because there's hardly any matching blood flow in those compartments. Now, when you model this stuff, you start to find out some really interesting answers to these questions that we're raising. Because one of the things you can do when you model these distributions is you can actually calculate the distributions of gas exchange that accompany them. Now, I've been doing this for a little while using my computer modelling. The thing that annoys me the most about this field is that the computer power to do this has now been around for half a century, when computers used to look like this. But nobody seemed to take any interest in it or take the trouble to actually do it. So generating these sort of gas exchange distributions is really quite easy to do. So this is the distribution of oxygen uptake on the left, the green one, and the distribution of CO2 elimination is the one on the right. You can see how they diverge as VQ scatter worsens. So the CO2 elimination is really not happening in the same parts of the lung as the oxygen uptake. They significantly diverge, which puts a lie to the concept of this ideal compartment where everything's happening at the same time. It's never been true, the ideal compartment. There's nothing ideal about this lung at all. You can also do the same thing for your anaesthetic gases. So here's your halothane, here's your isoflurane, here's your SIVO, and there's your desflurane distributions that would accompany these distributions of ventilation and blood flow. Now you can see how, as the solubility of the agent goes down, the distribution of its gas uptake goes to the left, or it gravitates towards the low VQ lung compartments. That's just the simple mathematics of the Fick equation at work. And this explains all our findings about dead space. So you can see why for CO2, you might say you've got this much wasted ventilation happening. But for your desflurane and sevoflurane, which gravitate to the low VQ compartments, much more of that alveolar ventilation is effectively wasted because it's not engaging in gas exchange. This is why we get these wildly different numbers for the dead space for our anaesthetic gases and its relationship to solubility, and it's so different to CO2, which is much more soluble than any of them. And in fact, when we model this, we get a really good match to the measured best fit line in these measured values for dead space that we got. So we've explained this phenomenon using a more realistic model of distribution of ventilation and blood flow. So the problem is the ideal compartment doesn't work. But I can offer you, when we consider these realistic distributions, physiological distribution of ventilation and blood flow, I can actually offer you a better concept of ideal alveolar gas than this mythical box in the middle of these three boxes. I put to you that a rational definition of ideal alveolar gas lies at this point here. So when you plot the distribution of CO2 elimination in this lung, the point at the top of this curve is a rational definition of ideal alveolar gas for CO2. It's what I call the modal point, because on a normal distribution, it's the modal point, the peak of the curve. And the reason I say it's a rational definition is because as VQ ratio increases to the right or decreases to the left, the effectiveness of gas exchange for CO2 declines. So this is the most, in a distribution, it's the most ideal point. But it's a point, not a box. Now the reason I offer this, because it might look quite complicated, And I would point out that you can do this for any gas. Every gas has a unique modal ideal point. It turns out that for any inert gas, the partial pressure at that point in the lung is exactly halfway between the arterial and the entitled partial pressure. It's the midpoint. The modal ideal point lies halfway between those two values. Turns out that for CO2, with a high degree of precision, the same applies, because CO2 has a relatively linear dissociation curve, so it sort of behaves like the inert gases do. So this is quite a simple solution. What I would propose is that the Enghoff modification is replaced with something that looks like this. It's a very simple calculation to make. Alveolar dead space calculation would look like this. Pretty simple to apply in practice. Any patient with an arterial lining allows you to, you need that to do Enghoff, and you can do this exactly the same way. You end up with a different number, but it's based on a much more physiologically cogent model of gas exchange than Riley can ever offer. Look, the same principle can apply to ideal alveolar oxygen as well. It's a bit more complicated. Once again, published this last year. The same principle can apply. The equations are a little bit more complex. So I'll just summarise now, because I've bombarded you with a lot of stuff here. There is no definitive alveolar dead space for gases across the lung. It varies enormously with the solubility of the agent. The Riley model that we're all taught ignores this. It can't conceive of this. It has an ideal compartment which is completely inaccessible to measurement. And the alveolar gas equation is fundamentally flawed to begin with, because it doesn't actually calculate ideal alveolar gas at all. But if you start thinking about realistic distributions and the accompanying distributions of gas exchange that go with those, we actually have what I put to you is a better concept of ideal alveolar gas, which is although terribly simple to measure in clinical practice, if that's what you want to do. So, a lot of reason to rethink these ancient mantras and teachings that we've been given, and I thank you very much for your attention.